Nancy Wilson was born on March 16, 1954 in San Francisco, and she was the third youngest child in the family. Unlike her sister Anne, who turned to music as a way to work through her teenage struggles, Nancy fell in love with music early on simply by listening to records and copying what she heard. In their memoirs, both sisters recalled that a turning point came on February 9, 1964, when Nancy and Anne watched the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show. Still, even though Nancy was the youngest in the family, the spotlight almost always landed on Anne. In Kicking and Dreaming, Nancy admits that she and Lynn used to joke from childhood that they were working on Anne's staff. That said, Nancy wasn't really living in her sister's shadow. She was more of an observer, someone who chose not to submit to Anne's lead, but to learn by watching and imitating her. By their school years, Nancy and Anne had formed their first band, Viewpoints, which played its first show at a folk festival in 1967. Soon after, the sisters decided to return to a duo format and define their own roles. They learned to write songs together. Anne gravitated toward vocals, while Nancy realized that her territory was the guitar, especially acoustic. For her, it wasn't just an instrument, it was a way to speak through music in her own voice, not to overpower the world, but to carve patterns into it. The sisters' duo didn't develop much at the time because Nancy focused on her studies, dreaming of going to university, while Anne took a more rebellious path, dropped out, and searched for a band where she could fully express herself. When Anne joined the Daybreaks and got a chance to record, she invited her younger sister to help record a few songs they had written together. The engineer allowed them to record Through Eyes and Glass, a song written by Nancy and Anne. That track ended up on the B-side of a country song called I'm Gonna Drink My Hurt Away. However, it was credited as a release by Ann Wilson and the Daybreaks, and Nancy wasn't even listed as a co-writer. No one seemed openly hurt by it, but the sisters' paths did separate for a while when Nancy left to attend college. While Anne fought her way toward the spotlight, Nancy devoted herself to her studies. Still, she never walked away from music. Whenever she could, she played solo shows in student spaces, performing both her own songs and covers. This wasn't a period of waiting in her sister's shadow. Nancy was discovering herself as an artist, learning how to hold a room on her own without a band, without volume, relying only on the precision of her hands and her inner sense of rhythm. So, when Anne invited her to join the newly forming Heart, Nancy was ready. Proof came in a tough initiation. When she arrived in Vancouver, she faced resistance from some band members who didn't believe Anne's younger sister deserved a place in such an ambitious project. Nancy was given a test to learn and play the intro to Clap by Yes. She mastered it in one day and played it with the band the very next night at a tavern. After that, she earned her spot. In many ways, this moment became crucial for Heart. Nancy's acoustic language was exactly what the band needed, a group that until then had lived mostly in dense electric bar rock. From there, the famous chemistry took shape. Anne's voice and Nancy's guitar, a contrast of light and shadow that would later be known as the signature sound of Heart. After Heart fully came together and work began on the debut album, Anne naturally stepped into the spotlight and took the lead. But Nancy never disappeared into her sister's shadow. Her role was to hold the second line, and she did it perfectly. On Dreamboat Annie from 1975, you can feel Nancy's presence from the very first seconds. She plays both acoustic and electric guitar, sings backing vocals, and essentially carries the second layer of the songs. And in the story of Crazy on You, there's an important detail that often gets missed. That gripping intro is a perfect example of an acoustic guitar not being there for decoration, but acting as the driving engine of the track. After the success of the debut album, life behind the scenes became more complicated. It felt like success had arrived, but the money still hadn't. Heart were living in survival mode. First stay afloat, then try to record. Real, adult conflicts of interest surrounded the band. Labels, contracts, and ownership of the music. And those conflicts directly interfered with creativity. The clearest example is the story of Magazine. The album was first released by Mushroom Records in an unfinished form, without the band's permission. A legal battle followed, and only later did an authorized version come out. This wasn't just another show business scandal. It was the reality of having your songs physically sent to stores without you, and being forced not only to write music, but to fight for the right to finish it. It was during this tense period that Nancy began to show herself not just as a performer, but as someone who helped hold the band together when the business side tried to tear it apart. This was especially clear in how she supported her sister, who carried the leadership role. With Nancy, Anne could share everything she was going through, and because who else, if not a sister, can support you at any moment in any situation. The next step came with Little Queen in 1977, where Nancy's role grew even stronger. Acoustic guitar, electric guitar, vocals, and even instruments rock guitarists aren't usually expected to play, like the mandolin and auto harp. For Hart, Nancy was no longer just the lead guitarist you hear the loudest. She was gradually becoming the band's musical director, the person who expanded the palette and gave the songs depth and dimension. Another powerful symbol of 1977 was Barracuda. The song was born out of anger at sexism and the dirty games played around the band, including a fabricated promotional rumor about an improper relationship between the sisters, linked to their label and industry figures at the time. Ann wrote the lyrics in a burst of rage after a disgusting comment from a promoter, and Nancy added the melody and the bridge, turning raw anger into a structured song. The track wasn't just a big success. Once again, it highlighted Nancy's ability to turn external chaos into something that actually works as a song. Not just a scream, but a hit. A year later, the band made an interesting turn that seemed to underline how Ann was beginning to share creative leadership with her younger sister. On Dog and Butterfly, released in 1978, Hart leaned noticeably toward a more acoustic, folk-oriented sound. Even descriptions of the title track emphasize its restraint, noting how Ann and Nancy drew on their folk influences. The core songwriting team also became Ann and Nancy, with Nancy bringing in her longtime friend Sue Ennis as a co-writer. The fact that the band moved fully under female control was no accident. Behind the scenes, a real drama was unfolding. For a long time, the Wilson sisters had romantic relationships with the Fisher brothers, Michael and Roger. When those relationships collapsed, the brothers left Hart, and that marked the beginning of the true Wilson sisters era, a return to the duo that had started back in their school days. The first album the sisters made without the Fisher brothers was Bebe Lestrange, released in February 1980. Nancy fully used the freedom she gained after Roger's departure and became a core architect of the album, working on completely equal footing with Ann. Guitars, backing vocals, mellotron, and on one track, Nancy even takes the lead vocal and plays almost all the instruments herself except the drums. Then came a decade that forced almost every major rock artist to make a choice. Either you change along with the industry, or the industry changes you without asking. Hart had a name and an audience, but the poorly received album Private Audition dealt a serious blow to their reputation. The band's lineup started shifting again. The last remaining longtime members, Mike DeRosier and Steve Fossen, believed the failure was tied to the Fisher brothers' departure. All of this hit Ann hard. She began to doubt her creative leadership, and once again, Nancy devoted herself to her sister. She became Ann's support outside the band, while also taking on the task of rebuilding the lineup and helping new members adapt musically. In 1983, with a new lineup, the band released Passion Works. Under the guidance of the Wilson sisters, it marked a turn toward a more mainstream rock sound, moving away from the earlier mix of hard rock and folk toward a more radio-friendly aesthetic. But this creative shift didn't bring the breakthrough they hoped for. On paper, Passion Works wasn't a disaster, but it wasn't a triumph either. The album reached number 39 on the Billboard 200. How Can I Refuse climbed to number 44 on the Hot 100 and even hit number 1 on the Hot Mainstream Rock Tracks chart for 1 week. Still, the overall trend was hard to ignore. Even respected industry sources noted that Hart's early 80s period moved slowly. Another blow came when Epic Records dropped the band after 2 ambiguous albums. It seemed as if the Wilson sisters duo was headed for oblivion, but the sisters made a decisive choice to embrace the new musical wave and find management that could help them enter the MTV era with confidence. That decision led Hart to sign with Capitol Records. That signature on paper came at a high cost, especially for Nancy. She later recalled how producer Ron Nevison openly said that acoustic guitars looked outdated in the digital 80s. This was deeply uncomfortable for her because acoustic guitar was her first love and a core part of what she had brought to Hart back in the 70s. It's an honest, almost painful detail. To keep Hart alive, Nancy had to temporarily step away from what made Hart feel like her heart. The results of working with Capitol were immediate. The sisters didn't just change their style, they released Heart, an album that gave them a commercial second youth, what people usually call a comeback. In this new version of Capitol-era Heart, Nancy became more than just an instrumentalist. She grew into a figure who expanded the band from the inside, through vocals, arrangements, and the way the group navigated a changing era. Her lead vocal on These Dreams Released as a single in January 1986, was a turning point for Nancy, not only as a member of Heart, but as a public face of the band. The song became Heart's first #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and most importantly, it was the first major Heart hit where the lead vocal was sung by Nancy, not Ann. Within the sisters' dynamic, this felt like a quiet revolution. Nancy didn't take Ann's place. She expanded the very idea of who could be the voice of a Heart song. After Heart, the success machine fully kicked in. Bad Animals, released in May 1987, became another massive commercial step forward. The album reached #2 on the Billboard 200, later went triple platinum in the US, and the single alone hit #1. What mattered most was that this was no longer a lucky comeback tied to 1985. It was proof that Heart had firmly established itself in a new era. Nancy's role during these years grows far beyond just the band's sound. On the Bad Animals tracklist, there's a clear marker of that shift. There's The Girl, co-written by Nancy Wilson and Holly Knight, and released as a single. This is a case where Nancy doesn't simply adapt to the trend of songs written by professional hitmakers, but steps into that world as a co-writer, while still remaining an insider within the band. By the end of the 80s, riding on the wave of her own successes, Nancy effectively takes on creative leadership within Heart. Compared to Ann, she feels more at ease in the 80s, even though she has fully stepped away from her beloved acoustic style. In the early 90s, Heart releases Brigade, which climbs to #3 on the Billboard 200. The era's biggest hit, All I Want to Do Is Make Love to You, reaches #2 on the Billboard Hot 100. Under pressure from the times, the sisters move away from writing their own material, and the lead singles are handled by outside songwriters. Nancy's role as the new creative leader is to preserve the soul of Heart through the music, giving any lyric a sound that still feels truly like the band. Even though Brigade was successful, the new decade demanded new changes and new transformations. Grunge was gaining momentum, radio was shifting, and the glossy arena rock of the late 80s started to feel like yesterday's clothes. Still wearable, but a bit awkward. In 1991, Heart releases the live album Rock the House Live as an attempt to show they're still a real rock band with teeth, not just a hit-making machine. But the times had already changed, and the album's chart performance was modest. The Wilson sisters weren't ready to reinvent themselves again, and tried to hold their place in the industry on the strength of their name alone. In the early 90s, Nancy, along with Ann, Sue Ennis, and musicians from their close circle, forms an acoustic side project called Love Mongers. It began as a benefit concert, connected to the Gulf War, and the name Love Mongers was deliberately chosen as a response to the era's aggressive rhetoric. There's a distinctly Nancy-style irony here. Since they didn't have a drummer, the rhythm was programmed on keyboards, and a cardboard cutout of Ringo Starr was brought on stage. In 1993, back under the Heart name, the sisters release Desire Walks On, followed by The Road Home. These projects are attempts to return to their roots while still offering something new, without losing themselves. And although the albums performed decently, it was clear to everyone that Heart's best days were behind them. By the mid-90s, Heart once again found itself without a label. Nancy understood that the band needed a break, and she was the one who pushed for Heart to go on pause. Wanting to rest and reset, she stepped away from music for a while and moved into film alongside her husband, director Cameron Crowe. This opened a new chapter in her life. She focused on building a family and writing music for films, earning recognition for some of her work, including her contribution to Jerry Maguire. In January 2000, Nancy and Crowe welcomed twin sons. The children were deeply wanted and long awaited, especially given Nancy's health challenges. Because of that, she fully devoted herself to raising them. The return doesn't happen until 2002. Heart goes back on the road, and Nancy later describes that period as a family circus. The tour turns into a moving caravan with kids and nannies, as if a rock band had suddenly become a traveling home. In 2004, Jupiter's Darling is released, Heart's first studio album since 1993. Nancy serves as a co-producer, and according to the official notes, the band writes most of the material themselves. It feels like her attempt to restore Heart's musician's pride, to put guitars and songs back at the center, ahead of industry formulas. The return to the stage, and the intensity with which Nancy throws herself into rebuilding this new version of Heart also becomes a turning point in her personal life. Her marriage to Cameron Crowe ends in divorce in 2010. After that, Heart gradually returns to a more regular studio rhythm. First comes Red Velvet Car in 2010, followed by Fanatic in 2012. For a moment, it feels like Heart is gaining momentum again. But in 2016, a tragic event once again puts the band on pause. During a tour, a family conflict erupts. Anne's husband is arrested after an incident involving Nancy's 16-year-old twin sons. He later pleads guilty to assault charges. After that, the relationship between the sisters becomes strained, and Heart enters an indefinite hiatus. Nancy doesn't disappear during this time. She forms the project Roadcase Royale and continues performing. By 2019, the Wilson sisters reunite, and Heart officially ends the pause, announcing the Love Alive tour. From there, Nancy begins living in two parallel worlds. In 2021, she releases her solo album, You and Me. In 2022, she starts touring under the name Nancy Wilson's Heart, with a set list largely built around Heart's legacy. In 2024, the band announces a major Royal Flush tour and even releases a new song, Roll the Dice, as a signal that this isn't just a nostalgia run. Then the plans unravel due to Anne's health. First, the European leg is cancelled. Then a diagnosis and the need for treatment are announced, leading to the cancellation of the remaining 2024 shows. Still, the public message stays clear: this is a pause, not an ending. And the facts back that up. Heart's official website lists tour dates for 2026, which means Nancy Wilson's story is not over yet. Nancy Wilson is a striking artist who came into music not to dominate, but to shape form, to connect strength and fragility, noise and silence, success and pause. When eras broke, lineups collapsed, and the industry demanded masks, Nancy chose neither resistance nor escape, but adaptation without self-erasure. That's her rare strength. She didn't outlast time, she learned how to speak with it, and maybe that's exactly why Heart has changed its skin so many times without ever losing its heart. Because there was always someone there who understood that music lasts longer than ambition, and that steadiness matters more than volume.